All right, hello everybody. We're going to go ahead and get started here. Today, we're going to be talking about tolerance range, which is essentially just a straightforward concept in which we will look at how changes to conditions around organisms can affect their reproductive potential, population size, and how far can an organism be pushed until it finally goes extinct. So, in order to talk about how organisms are impacted, we need to talk a little bit about their niches or their jobs. So, organisms all play roles in their ecosystems. So, for example, this bat here is a secondary consumer that hunts primary consumers at night. It's an endemic or a native species to the ecosystem. It's a major source of nitrogen and phosphorus in soils. So, these are all just part of things that make up its role or its niche. Okay? Now, when we look at niches in ecosystems, we're going to have four major roles that an organism will fit into. The first one is it might be a native or an endemic species. These are species that are indigenous to an area and are products of local evolution. A non-native species is a species that are foreign but improve or have no impact on the natural capital of biodiversity. So sometimes an organism can enter a new ecosystem and have no negative input. Instead, it might actually increase biodiversity. So that would be a non-native species. This is in contrast to an invasive species. This is exactly the same as a non-native. However, it does create some sort of issue in terms of natural capital, competition, or decreasing biodiversity. And then finally, you have keystone species. And these are species that play a large role in establishing the community. Typically, these are going to be your top predators because they control other population sizes from the top down. A good example of this is the wolves of Yellowstone, which I'm sure you've heard of at some point in the past. Now, as organisms exist in their ecosystem, fulfilling their niches or their roles, they're all going to have something called a tolerance range. And a tolerance range is the range of abiotic conditions within their habitat that they can exist in. Okay, so organisms can only take so much change in their environment before the population starts to go down. Now, these extreme conditions can impact a lot of things, stuff like limited growth, limited reproduction, difficult respiring, potential asphyxiation, hormonal disruption. We'll talk more about these as we get into later units like 5 or 6, but just know that if organisms are asked to exist outside of their normal range, then physiological issues start to occur. Now, typically when we look at tolerance ranges, there are some common abiotic factors that we will use. Things like pH, temperature, salinity, sunlight, nutrient levels. These are all things that organisms have adapted to in their environment over time, and the changing of these can disrupt that biotic potential. Here's an example showing the tolerance range of different aquatic organisms. So for example, if we were looking at the pH of an aquatic ecosystem, fish prefer to live in waters that are 6.5 to about 9. Crab, snails, and mollusks, about 7.5 to 10. Plants can range from 6.5 to 12.5. So every organism has a certain range of conditions that it can live in. Once you get outside this range, you start to run into issues with the population size. Now, typically we can tell when abiotic conditions start to change thanks to some organisms that live in an ecosystem known as indicator species. And indicator species are often the first organisms to decrease when there's any type of change in the environment. So, for example, these mollusks here, they can only live in aquatic ecosystems that have above a 6 for pH. And if the pH changes above that, well, then those organisms are going to die much quicker than other ones. So these indicator species are super useful for scientists in order to better understand if an abiotic condition is changing in the ecosystem. Now, depending on how much the abiotic condition changes, an organism will be in one of 3 zones. You have the optimum zone. This is a zone or a range in which populations and reproductive potential is at its highest. You have a zone of stress when populations begin to decrease. Some organisms can survive, however, the population starts to rapidly plummet. And then you have a zone of intolerance. This is where organisms can no longer exist because the changing of the environment is too extreme. All right, and that's going to bring us to our FRQ question. Please make sure you read through the scenario and then answer the 2 questions, and we will talk about them in class tomorrow.